There is a kingdom where
Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for small group leaders at Dayspring. This video you're watching is designed for those of you who lead an off-campus small group for adults. So if you're a Sunday morning teacher for adults or students, there's a different video for you. You can go check that one out. But if you're an off-campus small group leader, you're going to be facilitating or hosting a small group that goes with the Sunday sermon from October 6th, then you're in the right place. We're going to go through this together. I'm going to walk you through your handout and hopefully make it a little easier for you to lead your small group this week, all right? You're going to need a few things with you. You're going to need about 15 to 20 minutes of time as I walk you through the handout. You're going to need the handout itself, which is your Going Deeper guide that goes, the one that's in the bulletin on Sunday, October 6th. You should have your advanced copy of that. You're also going to need something to write with. As I coach you through it, you may want to make some notes along the way, all right? So get your handout, and I'm going to walk you through it point by point. And again, my goal is to make facilitating your group a little bit easier for you, all right? Discussion point number one. This is how we always start off our small group times, by remembering and recapping what we heard in the Sunday sermon. Now, the Sunday sermon comes out of John, of course. We're in the Gospel of John. This is from chapter 11, where we read about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So your group is going to recap what they heard, anything they wrote down in their sermon notes. I encourage you as a group leader to take some notes during the sermon so that you can really facilitate the discussion here. If you didn't take notes during the sermon, then I would encourage you to go online and maybe re-listen to it, write down the main points, because that's going to help you get the ball rolling here, okay? So discussion point number one, it says, talk about what grabbed you from Sunday sermon and read John 11, 38 through 44 as a refresher using your notes if you took any. So let me give you a little tip here as a group leader. When you get to this point and you say, all right, y'all, let's talk about what we heard Sunday, what we took away from the sermon. I would always start off by reading that passage. Say, hey, let's talk about what we heard Sunday, what we learned, and by way of refresher, here it is, John chapter 11, 38 through 44. That should get people's wheels spinning. That should help them remember. And if you read that and you say, so what'd you take with you? What'd you pick up from the sermon? If people are still a little slow to respond and say anything, you may just want to grab a couple of key points from the sermon and just do the old, hey, so tell me what you thought about this point. And here are a couple that I would lean on if I were you. Number one, the point about how God loves us by sometimes delaying things that we want to happen. Just throw that out there and say, tell me about this. What do you think about this whole idea that God loves us sometimes by delaying things? Throw that one out there. Or the other point about how sometimes God loves us by giving us the exact opposite of what we ask for. So discussion point number one, you get the ball rolling, you get people talking. Read the text that's suggested there. Maybe throw out a couple of those statements that I just made. And again, those are things that are tied in specifically with the sermon from Sunday. So discussion point number one is all about getting people talking and discussing. In fact, discussion point number two on your handout is really just a carryover from discussion point number one. So that's what 1 and 2 are all about there. Getting everybody talking, getting everybody remembering what they heard. And in fact, some people may have really, on Sundays, every now and then, something lodges deep and really moves somebody and impacts them in a big way. And this is their chance to talk about that, which means that discussion points 1 and 2 may take up a big bulk of your small group time that you may not have necessarily anticipated. If that happens, that's good. I mean, that's okay. If people are talking about what they heard Sunday and how it moved them and how it's making a difference in their life and what they're doing in response to that, that's good. That's where we want people to get to. So if people really go on and on here, in a good way, let them, okay? So discussion point 1 and 2 is about getting the ball rolling. Now, that brings you to discussion point number 3. This is where you're going to kind of hunker down in the Bible, make sure everybody's got their Bible with them, because you're going to lead them through a specific passage here, okay? And let's look at that. Look at discussion point number 3. It says, many assume that God is committed to giving us what we want and that He's also committed to making our lives comfortable. Now think about this for a moment. A lot of people assume that God has a priority and a commitment to giving me what I want, and that God also has a commitment to making my life pretty much comfortable. And maybe that's an assumption that even you have. I guarantee you some people in your group have that assumption to some degree. And the way that we often hear this articulated is someone will say, they'll make a decision. They've been trying to make a decision, and they'll make a decision, and here was the rationale. Here was the rationale. Well, God just wants me to be happy. You ever heard that one before? Maybe you've said it before. Hey, God just wants me to be happy. In other words, God is committed and God has a priority to giving me what I want, what I wish for, and God also has a priority of making my life comfortable and even easy. Now, the problem with that is that the Bible paints a different picture. That's what your handout says there. Many assume that God is committed to giving us what we want and that He's also committed to making our lives comfortable, but the Bible paints a different picture. And this is where you're going to open up the Bible and you're going to see that different picture painted. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. At this point, everybody's going to be there in their Bible, and you're going to read them through it, and you're going to facilitate this discussion, which shows us that God's not necessarily committed to giving me what I want, and God's not necessarily committed to making my life play out the way that I would imagine it. Because that's what we're going to see here. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10, the Apostle Paul is going to talk about how this wasn't true in his life. That he lived with what he calls a thorn in his flesh. He said, I had to live with this thing on multiple occasions. I told God that I wanted Him to take it away from me because I wanted God to make me happy with this. And I wanted God to do what I asked of Him by taking this out of my life. And God never did. So the picture is way different in the Bible of, hey, God's just committed to giving me what I want, and God's priority is to make me happy in all the things that go on in my life. That's a way different picture than we see presented in the Bible. Now, here's what I would encourage you to do. In this whole passage about this thorn that Paul lived with, number one, I would encourage you before group time, make sure that you go back in 2 Corinthians 12 and understand the context of this passage. Look at the first 6 verses that precede the verses that you all are going to look at together. In the first 6 verses, Paul talks about how he really had every reason to be proud and boastful and kind of puffed up because he had a lot of accolades, he had accomplished a lot of things, he had a great pedigree. And Paul's basically saying, I had a lot of reasons to be proud in life, which helps us understand why God allowed him to live with this thorn. Paul says, I had to be made humble. I just had to be. And this is what did it for me, okay? So that's going to help you understand the whole context. Now, let me give you a couple of pointers about this this text that I think is going to help you as you lead some discussion here. Number one, the thorn in Paul's flesh, he never identifies what that is. He never clarifies exactly what it is. Was it something physical? Was it something emotional? Was it something relational? We don't know. And there may be some people in your group who act like they know what it is, but the reality is Paul never said what it was, so how could we know? And I take comfort in the fact that he doesn't tell us specifically what it is. You know why? Because I think that helps every one of us relate to it. We live with things in our lives that are difficult, that we hate, things that are painful and uncomfortable. It could be that Paul had the same exact thing. Maybe yours is relational, maybe it's physical, maybe it's vocational, I don't know. Maybe Paul had the same exact situation. So the fact that Paul doesn't detail what it is, he's just kind of vague and he just calls it a thorn in his flesh, I think that helps us identify with what the Bible's teaching here. So that's one thing to keep in mind if somebody were to say in your group, hey, what exactly was that? Or if somebody says, you know, I've heard it was this or that, you can at least say, well, you know, the Bible actually never spells out what it is. Maybe it was that. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it's what you live with. All right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Here's another thing to keep in mind because this helps us make our point. The word thorn that Paul uses here was a real specific word in his Greek language. It wasn't just like a little thorn that you get off of a rose bush. This is the word that was used like if someone actually impaled another human on a spear, all right, or an animal. That's the word that Paul used, an impaling spear. You say, man, that would be horrible. Yeah, it would be horrible. And that's the word that Paul uses here. Paul says, what I'm living with is so excruciating. It's like one of those poor people that we saw executed on an impaling spear. Paul says, what I'm living with is really hard like that. It's painful. It's really difficult. So here's the whole point here with discussion point number 3. It's about breaking down this false assumption that God's commitment is to give us what we want, that God's commitment is to make our lives easy and comfortable. That's not the case. It wasn't the case with Paul. It's not going to be the case with us. So at the very end of discussion point number 3, look at it. It says, as you look over these verses again, what evidence is there that God is not committed to our wishes or our comfort? And probably two answers here that come to mind. Number one, the fact that God allowed this to go on. I mean, this isn't beyond God's control to take it out of Paul's life. The fact that he allowed it shows us that that's not God's top commitment in making us comfortable. The second answer to that is the fact that that God actually said no. Paul asked God multiple times, will you take this out of my life? God never did. In essence, God said no. So the picture is painted that God is not committed, that God's priority is not me getting what I want. God's priority is not me being comfortable and living a life of ease. And before we leave discussion point number 3, let me throw this out there for you as a group leader. A couple of things that may be good resources for you if you're watching this way ahead of time. If you're watching this a day or 2 or 3 before you're going to be leading your group discussion, there are a couple of sermons in the Dayspring archive that may give you some additional food for thought. The May 25th sermon from this past year, May 25th, 2013, I actually preached on this very passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and the thorn in Paul's side. If you want a lot of maybe background information on this passage or just a better understanding of this passage, go back and listen to that one, May 25th, 2013. I preached on this very text. Now, if you really want to go back even further and dig a little deeper into the fact that God is not committed to me having a life of ease and comfort, and how my assumption that he does affects some of my decisions and those sort of things, go back all the way to 2012 to February 26, 2012. I preached a sermon on the idol of leisurely comfort. And that's back when we were talking about money, sex, power, and other lesser gods. The idea of leisurely comfort can become an idol in our lives. So if you really want to dig deeper into all of this, the May 25th sermon from this past year and the February 26th sermon from 2012, those might be some good resources you could listen to on your way to work and back. All right? Now, discussion point number 4. Look at it on your handout. This is a follow-up to discussion point number 3. If God's commitment is not to our wishes or comfort, then what is his priority and commitment? And the answer is really simple. His commitment is not to my way, but to his own way. And his commitment is not to me living comfortably and leisurely, but God's commitment is to me following his will and his plan. And when you think about all of this, think about it. God's commitment to his own plan and his own purposes, and his commitment in getting me involved in that, boy, what a great thing. Because God's way and God's plan and God's purpose is what's good for humanity as a whole. So for God to prioritize and make that a commitment that he has is such a loving thing on his end. Now, discussion point number 5, this is where you shift gears a little bit. The first couple of questions, you were recapping what you heard. The second couple of points here, you were getting into that 2 Corinthians 12 passage. Now, for the last 2, you're going to be kind of doing a little bit of a group project together by reading a few different passages and then coming up with a conclusion about them. So look at your handout. It says, read the following passages one at a time, and after each, write a simple truth that relates to what we're discussing. So your group is going to read 3 different passages one at a time together. And then after you read each one, you're going to lead them to write down just one simple truth. One simple truth. It doesn't have to be anything big or fancy. One simple truth that relates to what you've been talking about, okay? And by the way, here's something you may want to do. I know a lot of folks, especially in my small group, a lot of folks, when we're going through the handout here, a lot of us are looking at it on the church app or, on our phones or iPads. So when we get to a discussion point like this that requires us to write something out, sometimes we get a little jammed up. So what you might want to do is go ahead and have some copies of your handout available, that you've run some Xerox copies, so that when you get to this point, everybody can participate in this whole little project. So 3 passages, one at a time. Then you're going to write down a simple truth. So let me walk through these with you so that you make sure that you have a good answer, just in case everybody gets stumped. In fact, why don't we do this little project together, all right? Just you and I. Let's walk through this together. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Here's what I want you to do. I want you right now to go ahead and read those verses, and then I want you to fill in your blank there. One simple truth as it relates to what we're talking about. So get you a Bible if you don't have it. Go ahead and read those. Hit pause on the video right now. Write down, a thing, and then come back and join me, all right? So James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Did you read those? Did you write down something? Let's look at it together. A simple truth as it relates to what we're talking about. James talked about this. He said that he welcomed trials, he welcomed hardship. He actually welcomed when he didn't get his way, and he even welcomed when God gave him the opposite of what he asked for. Why? Because it made him more Christ-like. So here's what I wrote down on my handout. Here's what I wrote down. Not getting my way actually makes me better. Okay? So that's what I wrote down. If you were a little stumped, you didn't have a good answer, well, there's a good answer for you. Not getting my way actually makes me better. That's what we can learn there from James 1. Now, 1 Peter 4, 12 through 14. Do the same thing again. Read those verses. Write down a simple truth as it relates to what we're talking about. Go ahead and hit pause now. After you've done that, come back and join me, okay? So 1 Peter 4, 12 through 14. Did you read those and did you come up with an answer? Here's what I wrote down. I wrote down that pain precedes something that's better than just average. Pain precedes something in my life that's better than just average, because that's what Peter said here in this verse, these verses. He said, hey, the stuff that's happening to you, number one, don't find it odd. Everybody has to deal with this. But he said, it's a privilege to suffer with Christ so that his glory will be revealed. Well, you know what? The glory of God, whatever all that entails, is better than just life as normal. And if I want to experience something better than just life as normal, there's usually pain that comes before that. So pain precedes something better than just, life as usual. Now, one last one, Jeremiah 29. Look at that one, verses 10 through 14. Give that one a crack and then come back and join me. So Jeremiah 29, 10 through 14, if you read those and if you tried it. Now, this is one where some context is going to be helpful. So let me give this to you, okay? This is Old Testament Israel. They're living in a time where they have been exiled out of their own land. Now they've been driven off and living in a foreign land. And here's what people were saying. They were saying, we know that God's going to let us go back home. We know that because he's promised it. So everybody was saying, so let's pack our bags and get ready. Let's pack our bags and get ready. And what Jeremiah is going to tell them is, hey, you need to rent a house. You need to buy a house. You need to plant some gardens. You need to have your kids. You need to do all this stuff. You need to hunker down because you're going to go through a prolonged period of exile before you get what you want. That's pretty much what Jeremiah was telling them. And in fact, there's a lot of conditional things. He said, you're going to go through all this hardship. You're going to go through this time of exile. Then, after your hearts have been made right, then God's going to send you back home. So that's kind of the context of all of this. And let me tell you what I wrote down here on mine. I said delay and not getting my way is necessary for me to walk with God as I should. That took a little more room than I have on my little line there, but listen again. Delay from God and not getting my way is necessary for me to walk with God as I should. I don't know if it's just my stupidity or my human nature or what, but God has to not give me my way, and God has to not give me things on the timetable that I want them in order to make my heart right in a way that I can walk with him properly. And that's what we saw there in Jeremiah 29. He said, hey, after the time is complete, after these 70 full years are up, you need to unpack your bags. You need to put them in your closet and in your drawers because you're going to be here for a while. And then God's going to bless you with this very thing that you're hoping for and asking for, okay? So those are some simple truths that connect with everything that we've been talking about. And then finally, point number 6, look at your handout. Here's how you're going to wrap things up. Read this week's memory verses, and they're long as you can see. Read this week's memory verses, and notice this. Notice how Lazarus' sisters could have written these verses. And that should all make sense in light of Sunday's sermon, but it's pretty cool to realize that that Lazarus' own sisters could have said these very things. Don't be surprised at the painful stuff you're going through as if something strange were happening to you, but rejoice that you're participating in this so that you can be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. Boy, that's really going to tie together good with the Sunday sermon and really should tie a good bow on your whole discussion. Well, hopefully this coaching session's been good for you, helpful for you. I surely hope it helps you in leading your group to be a little bit easier. All right, thanks for tuning in. God bless you. Hope your group has a great time together.